Historic Preservation Commission. Before we move on to discussion agenda item number 8, are there any recusals on the commission? Seeing none, we will move on to discussion agenda item 8, 1901 and 1925 Hull Street, an appeal of determination eligibility, and we will begin with a staff presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim Bertolini, Senior Historic Preservation Planner. I'll be giving the staff report for this item. As mentioned, this is an appeal of staff determinations of eligibility for the properties at 1901 and 1925 Hull Street. Just showing the location of this property. This is effectively at the west terminus of Swallow Road, in between that and Taft Hill Road, south of Drake. This is an assemblage. This is in response to a development application and identification of historic resources on that site. Zooming in a little bit farther, this shows the two properties in question that are subject to this appeal this evening, 1901 and 1925 Hull Streets. To interpret this aerial photograph just a little bit, the structures in blue, these are the historic resources that were determined landmark eligible by staff. The other structures outlined in red are surviving accessory structures based on the significance under Standard 3 for design and construction. Those outbuildings were not considered part of that eligibility finding. And then some of the other resources you see on the aerial photograph have been demolished since this photograph was taken, so they're no longer present on the site. When appeals are brought forward for staff findings of determination, the commission provides this is a de novo hearing, so the commission provides a new decision on the eligibility of these properties. Just as a procedural recommendation from staff, we are suggesting that you separate your motions and adopt separate motions for each property. You're not required to find both eligible or both not eligible. Your role this evening is to consider evidence regarding significance and integrity of both of the properties. Those standards are under Municipal Code Chapter 14, Article 2, specifically 14-22. And your task this evening is to provide a determination of eligibility as an historic resource for the purposes of Land Use Code 347. That would, whether you find them eligible or not eligible, that would have an effect on the development application that precipitated this finding. Your final decision this evening will be subject to the right of appeal to City Council. Just a bit about the review timeline. The applicant contacted, or I should say appellant, in this circumstance, contacted our Office for Historic Survey on July 12th of this year. And over the course of summer and early fall, we completed the historic survey, and October 14th transmitted those findings to the applicant. In this case, we found that the southernmost property, 1839 Highline Drive, was not eligible, and that finding is not being appealed this evening. We also found that 1901 and 1925 Hull Streets were eligible, and those findings are being appealed. And that appeal was received on October 28th by the developer. This is just a note about where we are in the process for the land use code review of the development application, since we've received a preliminary development review, which is basically an advance look at the project. We are at the stage where we're identifying eligible properties on site and whether or not there's a responsibility under the land use code to retain and adaptively reuse them. That process takes us over to the municipal code, because that's where the standards for landmark eligibility live. And if you find these eligible, then we go back to the development application, and the application is required to retain and incorporate those resources. If they're found not eligible, that effectively ends consideration for this project. Historic preservation considerations for this project. Specifically here, as with all determinations of eligibility, we require two standards, two sets of standards be met in a linear fashion. So first, is the property significant? In this case, staff found that these two buildings were significant under design and construction. And do they have sufficient historic integrity to convey that significance? 1901 Hull Street, which is the easternmost property. This was a farm residence found eligible under Standard 3 for architecture as a significant intact example of an agricultural-related farmhouse that should read North Fossil Creek. I do want to note that the historic survey form that was produced, the contracted historian did recommend this property under Standard 1 for agriculture. Staff disagreed with that in our determination, and our reasons for that are contained in your packet. The Western farmhouse at 1925 Hall Street had a similar determination of eligibility as a significant and intact example of a farmhouse on the North Fossil Creek, Upper Spring Creek area. This just elaborates a little bit more on the history of both of these sites. 1901 Hall Street was constructed by 1925 by Ruth, well, not constructed by Ruth and John Hall. They lived at and farmed on the site. They are the namesakes for Hall Street. The western property, also known as the Shankula Hodges Farm, was active through the 1920s up to the 50s as an agricultural property, mostly in cherry orchard production. Then just a little bit about the background history here. There was some interesting history related to the Hall family farming on that site. However, based on staff's judgments and the historic context for agriculture produced in 1994, staff found that interesting but not significant to local agricultural history, both for lack of significance and also the loss of a lot of the outbuildings that were there during the farm's operation, including the main barn that you see in that photograph. So one of the things staff added to the context for our finding here is just an aerial photograph from 1950. And here, this is the same photograph on both sides of the image, just different scales. So here on the left is zoomed out a little bit more, or I should say zoomed in a little bit more, just showing these three properties that are part of this development application, these two being subject to the appeal. On the right, this is just zoomed out a little bit. So this is the same area that's shown on the left, just showing a larger context of agriculture in this part of town in 1950. We did have a couple of questions from the work session last week. The notice of appeal mentioned 4 properties that do have findings of eligibility. We did add those survey forms, a total of 5 survey forms to your packet for your consideration. Those were for 6824 South College, which had an intensive survey form, 2500 South Shields had an intensive survey form, and 2318 LaPorte. The 1108 and 1038 West Vine Drive properties were surveyed under a previous version of the code. So you have that demolition alteration review correspondence added to your packet. As you can see, there's really not a lot of historical information or assessment that was involved in those decisions. There was also a request to clarify the difference between architectural significance of a farmhouse versus historical importance for agricultural operations. Again, staff did not find that either property had particularly significant agricultural history. It had fairly typical history of producing locally important goods for market. Nothing that was particularly significant compared to what we would normally see, nor do they have a particularly intact farmstead. And so for that reason, staff did not really find them significant under Standard 1. However, we did find that both were particularly significant examples of a farmhouse for this section of Fort Collins. And I would note that typically that is what we ask our historians that do these surveys for us, or when staff does these ourselves. We do tend to localize the comparative research to either a neighborhood or a more local geographic area than the full geography of Fort Collins, the entire city. We have not received any public comments for this project or for this appeal. I did have an email exchange with a neighbor in the area, just interested in the outcome, but no specific weighing in either direction on the appeal. So again, just a reminder on your role here, you're replacing staff's decision with your own this evening as a de novo hearing, and considering evidence about significance and integrity, whether this meets, whether either or both properties meet those requirements, and providing a new determination of eligibility. That concludes the staff presentation. I will note I'll be here to answer questions. We do also have the historian that completed the survey forms, Ms. Becca Shields from Metcalf Archaeology. She's also present and can answer questions specific to her research process and methodology for review. With that, that concludes the staff presentation, and I'll hand things over to the appellant.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I did already sign in. All right.
Very good.
So, good evening, Chairman and members of the Historic Preservation Commission. My name is Zell Cantrell. With the True Life Companies, we're located down in Denver at 1601 19th Street. Before we get too deep into the presentation, I wanted to thank Jim and the Historic Preservation staff. Although the results of the surveys aren't quite what we were hoping for, they've been truly professional in their efforts to convey information to us and help us work through some decisions and bring us to this point. So I wanted to thank him for that. Just real quickly, the True Life Companies is a real estate investment firm. We're really focused on delivering housing in what we'd consider maybe underserved, high barrier to entry or infill sites throughout the country. As I mentioned before, we're located here in Colorado. We have multiple offices in Northern and Southern California, and we just recently opened an office in Austin, Texas, and one out in the Mid-Atlantic region. We've currently got 5 projects in the entitlement phase here in Colorado, multiple sites in California, and we're hoping to have 4 or 5 more sites. Even though the economy doesn't seem to be blowing any tailwinds right now, we still think there's some great opportunity here in Colorado, and we hope to have 4 or 5 more sites, even maybe some more sites here in Colorado or in Fort Collins underway later this year. So I think Jim did a really great job of describing the location. So maybe in the interest of time, unless there's some questions about where the sites are located, maybe I can skip that part of the presentation. All right. So as Jim indicated, we're appealing the determination of eligibility for Fort Collins landmark designation for the properties at 1901 and 1925 Hull Street. While we're respectful of the report and the efforts by the third-party consultant to make those determinations, we do question whether the standards are being applied consistently to all potential eligible structures, and therefore appreciate this opportunity to appeal the determination to you. Jim, we could probably skip the location slides, maybe go right to 1901. Yeah, Jim already shared these photos with you, but I think this is probably a good place to start. You know, this is 1901 Hull. It's located on the eastern portion of the overall property. It was determined to be eligible under standard number 3, distinguished design and construction, since the structure represents a rare remaining examples of 1920s farmhouse vernacular in a semi-rural setting. While we understand that a specific architectural style does not necessarily need to be associated with the structure to indicate eligibility, in this case, really, it seems like the simplicity, opposite of the discussions we had in the previous hearing, the simplicity is really what's at issue here and whether or not that constitutes eligibility. And then we had a couple other photos. Jim, I don't remember if you shared kind of the back and the side. I think it's worth noting that these structures may have been modified. I don't think there were any records in the permitting process or the historical review indicating additions to these homes, but based on the change in the roof angle and then also some changes in the siding, there's some vertical elements there. We questioned whether or not these buildings are maybe as original as maybe that we thought. And I think the same is true of 1925 Hull. Again, maybe move to the next slide, Jim. Again, we've got a kind of a change in the roof angle at the back. It looks like maybe there was an addition. And so we kind of question whether or not the original integrity here is applicable or not. And then moving on to some of the, there was 4 or 5 reports, I think, the commission requested that Jim provided. We got copies of those as well. And those were all pertaining to sites that we thought may have similar characteristics, but were deemed ineligible. Only 2 of the 3 or 2 of the 5 we thought were really applicable to this situation. This one at 2318 LaPorte was determined not eligible, largely based on the fact that it had been relocated and the original context was no longer in place. We don't really have a good feel for what the original context was, but I think it could be argued that it still exhibits some context because it is in a semi-rural setting, which we understand maybe to be the original location of the building. And then the other one was the Humar Farm, located at 6824 South College. Again, another example of a very simple farmhouse vernacular, which in our opinions, if you go to the next slide, Jim, retains several outbuildings, including a barn, a hay shed. It's our understanding there may even still be some livestock paddocks on the site. Really retains a lot of that rural farmhouse or semi-rural setting with accessory buildings. And so there's a large or a high level of context in place, but yet this was deemed non-eligible. And then furthermore, there was properties noted in the determination letter that appear to represent a high level of integrity as agricultural complexes. Although these haven't been surveyed, I want to make sure that's clear, but they're examples of other properties in the area that we feel represent a high level of rural farmhouse contextual integrity just based on the fact that there's still standing barns. The houses appear to be in good shape. There's other outbuildings as well. And then the next slide, similar situation. Although this one wasn't very visible, this one's located on South Shields. Again, we wonder if the same standards would apply here given the context. I've kind of lost my place here. Where I was going was, from our perspective, there are much better examples that represent a better farmhouse context or a farm operation setting with better integrity that should be preserved rather than the 2 buildings on our site. And then I think the one other thing that I'm not sure if it's in your purview or not, but I think it's worth mentioning is just what the anticipated future context of this area is going to look like, because the semi-rural context came up in several of the notes, but I think it should be noted per the existing zoning plan, all 3 properties, as well as several surrounding properties, are all designated currently for low-density mixed-use neighborhood, LMN, which would allow up to 9 dwelling units per acre in the future. And then the property directly north, which is shown here in kind of a pinkish color, is actually designated for what is called medium-dense mixed-use neighborhood, which would allow up to 12 dwelling units per acre and even multifamily development at some time. Furthermore, the city plan identifies this entire quadrant of Taft Hill and Drake as what they call mixed neighborhood, which is intended to encourage a variety of housing types as needed to support higher densities. I think one can argue that the semi-rural nature of the properties if it hasn't already been eroded by the encroachment of neighborhoods from the east and to a certain degree the neighborhoods from the south, that the existing zoning and city plans for the area will eventually eliminate any remaining rural nature to the point that the two structures are going to look out of place, leaving future people asking, why are these still here? And then the next slide. In addition to the zoning, the city master transportation plan calls for the extension of Swallow through to Taft Hill. It's also designated as a collector. It's going to be relatively high traffic. While it doesn't directly impact these two properties, I think it's just one more indicator of what the city envisions for this area in the future and the future erosion of that rural context. And then this is a site plan in the works, and hopefully people can kind of recognize this in the context of the aerial. But in the middle, the upper third of the site, you can see where Swallow will be extended from its existing dead end on the east side of the property. It'll be extended through the property and eventually connected to Taft Hill. That is part of the city master transportation plan. Whole Road to the north will be connected. Whole also dead ends at the eastern edge of the property. The difference is there's a dirt road there that continues all the way over to Taft. That will eventually be improved and form another connection to Taft Hill. We're currently planning 54 single-family residences on this property, and not only does Whole and Swallow need to be connected through to Taft, but the city's also looking to us based on our PDR comments to create a street grid here, and that's what you see with the north-south with different block designations. So this is going to turn into a much different neighborhood than what exists out there today. And then maybe just one last time with the aerial image. The future context of this area will look nothing like it does today based on both existing and planned conditions. Encroachment from the east and to the south have already eliminated much of the former rural context. Existing zoning designations combined with guidance from the city plan supports a greater density in this entire quadrant, which is further reinforced by the street grid. So I just want to thank you again for your time. As much as we understand the need for historic preservation and respect the hard work done by the preservation staff and the commission, we just question the consistency in the application of the standards to these two particular examples. We question whether or not these are the best examples of this type of vernacular, and would the community be better served? There was discussion in the reports about the quantity being reduced as Fort Collins expands and the need to save some of these, and the question, or save as many of them as we can. Our question is, do we want to focus on the quality ones or maybe the not so quality ones in our opinion that these represent? So thank you in advance for your consideration. I'm here to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We will have public comment and then move on to questions. Is there any public comment? Hearing none, we will move on to commission questions for staff and for the appellant.
Jim, could you clarify what the implications are if the commission upholds the eligibility designation? Does the applicant then have to wait, was it 3 years or something like that? I recall from previous situations where they have to wait 3 years until they can come back for another eligibility discussion if during that 3-year period nothing's done to actually designate the properties?
Sure. So I think the question is how long these findings are good for. The code specifies 5 years from the date of issuance. And at that point, yes, we can consider any changes that have happened to the property, any differences in how we're interpreting history, any new evidence that might be relevant. At that point, we can reconsider the finding.
Okay. So if no other party comes forward to actually pursue historic designation, then essentially the properties sit dormant for 5 years unless the applicants decide to sell them or submit a different different plan?
Again, with our goal and the intent of the land use code pertaining to historic resources, and this is designed to tie into the policies and purposes in Municipal Code 14.1 and 14.2, is that they not sit empty. The intent of requiring historic resources to be incorporated on a development site is that they still have a use, whether that's housing units or a commercial unit or office or something like that. So ideally, they're not sitting vacant. Ideally, they're being used for something else. But that is a possibility, of course.
And so just a follow-up question for the applicants then, if I may, have you considered, and maybe I missed something here, wouldn't be the first time, but have you considered any opportunities to incorporate these buildings into your design plans?
We have. I don't know if Jim, if you can go back to that site plan, and I know it's a work in progress, and if you have any questions about it, I probably didn't clarify that very well, but we did indicate the two buildings in red on that plan there at the northern edge of the site. Based on the requirements for a park and also for detention, there's a fairly large area. It's pretty close to the end of the presentation. There's a large area there that we'll do both with, and that would we could potentially locate or leave 1901 whole in its current position, although it does encroach into the future whole right away. I know that's not very clear, but it's the L-shaped building, and it would encroach. So either we're going to have to do a modified right away, or we're going to have to relocate the building. And the question is whether or not it's feasible to do that. And then the 1925, which is the building a little bit further west, it sits a little bit out of the right of way. We're still going to have to make some modifications. In theory, that could be incorporated into the development as well. I think our concern is more of just once these newer houses are built, knowing that we have to demonstrate some historical compatibility within 200 feet. I think the question is still going to be raised: why are these here? And I think it could be detrimental to what we expect to be a very successful project in an area, Fort Collins, that doesn't have a lot of building going on right now.
I have a question for Jim. Jim, so this is considered part of the Fossil Creek community, or I don't know what that's called, Fossil community, is that right?
Yeah, so in terms of defining a localized geography, which admittedly with agriculture is difficult, usually it's defined by watersheds, especially in the West. And this area is kind of in what we might consider the upper end of Fossil Creek, but most of the water is diverted off of Spring Creek or the Poudre River. So that was the motivation behind using that as our localized geography, was just trying to define this as kind of the upper portions of those drainages. But it's certainly a little bit far to the northwest to be sort of part of the core Fossil Creek community or Harmony farther to the east.
It seems like we often define those communities mostly based on what school the kids get sent to, and that's why it's named Fossil Creek, because that was the name of the school, I believe. I should have asked this last week, but I didn't think about it until I saw that slide of talking about localized areas. But off the top of your head, maybe you can answer this. Do you know if we have any landmarked properties related to the Fossil Creek community? I know we have some for Harmony, but I can't think of any related to Fossil Creek.
In this part of Fort Collins, off the top of my head, I don't believe so. I can, if you'll give me a minute to look that up, while maybe other questions come in, I can see. I don't believe we actually have many landmarks at all in this part of the city, but I can look that up on our historic resources map.
Okay, thanks.
While Jim's looking that up, are there other questions from commissioners, clarifying questions, or otherwise we can move into discussion, and as Jim pulls that up, then
I do have another question.
Yeah.
This can either be Jim or maybe Becca, but I would just like to hear more about the outbuildings and why they were determined not to be eligible.
Certainly, I can speak to that. So, with the finding that these two properties were significant for their architecture, specifically as examples of a vernacular farmhouse that's really focused on the architecture of the houses themselves. We could, about the only time you're going to see outbuildings considered architecturally significant is if there's an assemblage of outbuildings that are all like specifically designed in a similar style or with similar materials or things like that. That's not the case here. Most of what's there is a pretty generic set of either loafing sheds, chicken coops, things like that that are just fairly generic, don't have any specific architectural connection to the main farmhouse. So that's the reason they weren't considered eligible here. Normally, when you see outbuildings considered historic, it's under Standard 1. The area is agriculture, and they're part of the historic context and historic landscape for that working farm.
Okay. So then, in that regard, the setting of all of that land, open space around it, is less significant if we're looking based on architecture than if we were looking based on a farmstead, right?
Typically, when we're evaluating for architecture, setting's less important. It's not a non-factor, but we tend to emphasize the integrity aspects of design, workmanship, and materials in those cases.
Right, thank you.
And return to the previous question just about identified historic resources in this area. We don't have very good survey. So what I'm showing on the screen is our historic resources map that's online and available to the public and shows all of our up-to-date designations and historic survey results that are active and certified. And we don't really have a lot of current survey records at all for this part of town. In fact, this is some of our first survey work, recent survey work in this. We have some legacy data that's not reflected here, but most of that's well over 10 years old.
So this is just indicating surveys, not landmark.
It does also indicate landmarks. We don't have any landmarks in this quadrant of the city.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions? If not, let's move into discussion on these items, and if it makes sense to do to talk about these two separately for separate motions, I would entertain that. If the discussion moves toward kind of a more global idea, then I think that a single motion would be just fine. And we're looking at significance and integrity under 14-22.
Before we start with that, I'd like to say I feel like the code and the plans are at odds with each other in this one. And it's happened before. It hasn't happened recently, but I think it makes the whole situation much more difficult. And I'd also say, much as Eric hates the two-step process, I feel like I really wish we had the two-step process here to differentiate between are they eligible and is it worth keeping them here. So just throwing that out for whenever 3.4.7 gets looked at again, it's possible the two-step process would be helpful in a scenario like this.
If I may offer some clarification, Mr. Chairman, I know we're out of that. Actually, that is technically the case here. The intent tonight is that you consider significance and integrity and just replace the finding. The considerations of value of preservation compared to the project and things like that typically comes into play when you would be commenting on a development application and providing your comment for the decision maker and perhaps entertaining a modification of standards. There is a two-step process here. It just looks a little different when we're processing a development application.
Thank you, Jim.
So just to clarify, because it's almost 9:15, we're in step 1 tonight.
That's correct. So the task for you this evening is to determine if these properties meet the standards for significance and integrity.
And we would have the opportunity at a later date to weigh that against the values component that we were discussing earlier.
That depends on your decision.
Of course.
But yes, assuming either or both properties are determined eligible, you would be commenting on the development application later.
Jim, would you mind commenting just on the integrity issue relative to the rather large additions that are on both of those properties that the applicant mentioned? It did look like with the change in roof line and the scale of the what appears to be additions that would have an impact on integrity, but staff still found that they do meet integrity requirements?
Yes. So yes, that is typically something we measure, especially with architectural significance. There is a heavy emphasis on the original construction. There is some allowance for that, and that is included in Standard 3, the language of Standard 3 in the city code, that sometimes alterations that are significant in their own right can be considered part of that. In this case, since additions, especially rear additions for kitchens, extra bedrooms, storage cellars, things like that, are a pretty common addition to a farmhouse. That's the reason staff at least found that those modifications did not detract from integrity. But again, whether that's an appropriate course is something the commission can consider.
Just to clarify again, you found that they didn't detract from the integrity or that they were significant in their own right? I apologize if that's in the packet.
That's okay. I'm not sure if I'm that specific in your packet. I would say they don't detract from the significance.
Yeah, it's interesting that under in design and construction for significance, just looking at the code, it says a resource can be significant not only in the way it was originally constructed or crafted, but also the way it was adapted for a later period, or the way it illustrates changing tastes, attitudes, and or uses over a period of time. So that seems to be in the purview of eligibility. I understand time's marching, but I would like to hear from some of the other commissioners' thoughts around this. And again, we have a rather narrow charge of eligibility for this one.
So we're moving into the discussion section
Yes.
of our agenda. Okay. I'll kick it off by saying that I'm not sure that I have a clear, after everything that we've looked at tonight, I'm not sure. I would love to hear from anyone on the commission that feels a little bit more sure one way or the other, just to start the conversation, please.
Go ahead, Bonnie.
I don't know. I don't know.
I can tell a story. Once upon a time, the chair of this commission came once a week down to the city offices and looked at all the buildings that were slated for demolition that had asked for a permit. And we would go through it. It was me and Tom, CD&S director at the time. And we would go through and figure out, does it have significance? If no, they got their permit. If we felt it had significance, then does it have integrity? If no, then they got their permit. If we felt like it was eligible, then they got a sign, and then they got their permit. So there were several times when we would get a house, it was usually houses we got, although we got some commercial properties, that I felt really contributed to the history of the city. But we didn't feel like our argument was strong enough that it was a hill we were willing to die on. And we would let those houses move on through the system. And I feel like this is one of those scenarios today. And I agree with Zell on a lot of what he said. My biggest concern is that we have an entire community's history that is being wiped out. And that does concern me. We have 0 landmarks for Fossil Creek. And because Fort Collins has blobbed and rolled over onto that community, just like we did with Harmony, there is some sense where we need to take their history into consideration and preserve it. At the same time, as Zell pointed out quite well, I think there are other properties that convey this better. So if somebody was bringing this property to us for landmarking, I think we'd probably go with that. I think we would find it to be eligible. This is why I struggle with this decision for this particular one. We're not talking about landmarking it at all. We're just talking about whether it's eligible. And I find it, I struggle with this one. I struggle with whether it really has the level of significance we would want. And yet I struggle again in the other direction about the whole Fossil Creek, and we're just wiping Fossil Creek out. And we're not preserving the important places. It almost makes me wish for some kind of context and a few surveys for Fossil Creek so that we have a better sense of what do we really need to stand on that hill that we'd be willing to die for, and which ones. I don't even know how connected these people were to Fossil Creek, if their kids went to the Fossil Creek school. And obviously those things don't matter for architecture, but that's where I'm really struggling. And we kind of had a way to not die on the hill before, and we don't have that anymore.
By God, I agree with Meg. Sorry, but
Oh my
You don't have to
goodness.
apologize for that.
no. I agree with Meg's comments entirely. When I look at significance and integrity of both of these structures, I'm kind of like, you know, is the community well served by preserving these properties? And I tend to say not so much, but there is an important history in that part of town where there may not be any properties that are going to tell the story. And so you struggle a little bit with, you know, the whole concept of what we're trying to accomplish here. Do we want to preserve these properties just to preserve them, or is there a bigger story to tell somewhere, somehow, that we could facilitate it? Obviously, we don't have resources and funds to go pursue that. Clearly, there's not consensus around any other properties or locations where we might find a more suitable representation of the historic aspects of the community. But I have a hard time looking at these two buildings and say they really tell a significant story.
Do both of these properties have the same level of significance? Like, is there a difference between them, or are we kind of considering them the same? And that's a question to the commissioners. I'm just curious. I think we're kind of considering them together, but is one more significant than the other?
That was kind of what I was thinking as well. Is one, can we, for the sake of our discussion, is there one of them that's in better shape, that's more representative. So we could say, okay, the other one we could make a motion on and take that one off the table and then talk about the other one.
Or if perhaps one is more significant or in better condition or has more integrity, perhaps that is the one that can represent the story, right? And save that history, and then the other one maybe not, if there's one that's more better representative than the other.
I'd also point out that even if we do find them eligible, there is a process the developer can still go through to demolish the houses. And then it's a matter, like as Jim said, when it comes back to us for development review, which at that point it might not if there's no historic resources left. But I would assume there'd still be some kind of contact where we talk about how is that mitigated, what can be done to still speak to that history. I mean, is that accurate, Jim? That's still a possibility?
Sure. So to just discuss the modification of standards process, there are several criteria that an applicant can use to, and this is true of any standard in the land use code. This is not specific to historic preservation, but they can apply for a modification of standard. That says they're not going to meet the standard, but they're going to do something else, either based on, typically it's either a hardship, or if they can come up with an as good or better than equivalent. I don't have direct experience with us recommending any modifications of standards that would include demolition. We've done a few that include alterations. They're not typically allowed. I think one of the more recent examples is the Alpine Bank development at Prospect and College, where we allowed the relocation of a historic building. That did get a modification of standards to allow for the relocation of that structure. So that's the only one I have direct experience with. But yes, there is a process to meet the code in a different way, and still make a positive recommendation to Planning and Zoning in this case, the Planning and Zoning Commission, for approval of something that modifies or demolishes a historic resource.
I think I'm of similar mind to most of the discussion so far. I have real concerns about how these two, I know we're supposed to bifurcate and talk individually, but I think, Jenna, to your comment, I think it's interesting that these are sort of a piece. I think they're very similar. We don't know very much about either one. There's speculation even about who lived there. I don't see the significance in terms of standards for design and architecture, because I think they are so prosaic, so simple. And we have in our packet examples of houses that were proposed for demolition that were approved that are not a great deal different. Their context is different because they're in town. But I don't think by virtue of just being located out in what's quickly becoming no longer rural, that context is even going to be evident for very long. And I think these are not a good example, and I only wish we could find some better examples, because I think it's difficult to know if they were modified, and obviously there have been some things done to change them. I think it's mostly speculation. So I guess I have similar thoughts. It's hard for me to think that, as Meg said, this is one of those hills we would be willing to die on. I don't think there's sufficient significance for these to warrant being made eligible.
I struggle with Western vernacular architecture. Because when they were built, it was what they could build, right? It's just a farmhouse, put it up. With no expectation that in 100 years we would be having this conversation. and the fact that we're even having the conversation of, well, can we just get rid of one so we can maybe talk about the other, kind of indicates that this isn't the hill we want to die on. And it is unfortunate that kind of that feeling of the agricultural lifeways of Fort Collins and that side of town have just been eliminated. I'm just not sure that these are the structures to say, hey, this really shows what it was like and why this was important. I just don't think these two structures are the ones we want to go after, for lack of a better word.
Well, I think at this point, if there's no more discussion on this, we could entertain a motion, and whoever is putting the motion together could either choose to bifurcate these or put them in the same motion. Sample motions on page 387.
Mr. Chairman, I can try one of these. I move that the Historic Preservation Commission find that 1901 Hull Street does not meet the eligibility standards outlined in section 14-22 of the Fort Collins Municipal Code and are not historic resources for the purposes of project review under Land Use Code 3.4.7, based upon the following findings of fact, which we have determined they do not either possess significance or integrity.
Thank you. And to clarify, you said just 1901.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's what we're supposed to do, right?
That was a suggestion. Yes. Is there a second to the motion?
That was at the direction of staff.
Well, Mr. Chairman, is it possible to amend that motion to include both properties?
I think it would be cleaner, since we have a motion on the table, to second the motion, discuss the motion, vote, and then have another motion.
I second the motion.
Thank you. Commissioner Gunther seconds.
Jim, I'm curious on your thoughts on the integrity, since we haven't really talked about that yet.
Well, first of all, I think so much of it is not known. I mean, we don't know if, for example, it possesses anything of extraordinary value in terms of workmanship. It certainly has been modified in a pretty clumsy way. And I chose this one because that's where I think it's maybe most apparent. But, you know, I think any of the issues of integrity, yes, location, it has location. It does possess some of those things, but the other part that really kills it for me is significance. Because I think if you read through 1422, it just doesn't have anything that says it's of quality because of a craftsman or of a particular style or period or anything. So that's the integrity is, to me, less of value. It's one of those things where if it doesn't have significance, then integrity doesn't play into it anyway. So
That's why I was intrigued that you included integrity instead of just saying significance.
yeah.
So I thought maybe there was something else there.
Well, I said significance and integrity because I think it doesn't possess sufficient number of those 7 aspects. It could say location and setting, but then when you go to the rest of it, I mean, feeling is going to be virtually lost easily within our lifetime. So, you know, a lot of those other things I think aren't carried forward in terms of integrity. So that's my rationale.
Other discussion on the motion? Hearing none, let's call for a vote. I will call for a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dunn,
Yes.
Gunther,
Yes.
Gibson,
Yes.
Rose,
Yes.
Nelson,
Yes.
Edwards,
Yes.
Knierim.
Yes.
The motion carries.
Thank you. All right, that leaves us with 1925 Hull Street and a continuation of our discussion around this. And my thought is, like we've talked about, are there better examples of this? And I think there have to be. I mean, some
Can't be our criteria.
right, absolutely.
I just don't find one objectionably different than the other.
Yeah, I think the wording of 14-22 in integrity is really interesting. It says, integrity is the ability of a site, structure, object, or district to be able to convey its significance. So if we say that this property does not have significance, can it convey that significance through integrity? I mean, I think it just kind of cascades down.
Yeah, integrity doesn't really matter unless there's significance.
Right.
I think our agricultural history is important, but I don't think that this is the house to tell the story.
I like the little decorative thing over the door on the original photograph, and it's a bummer it's not there anymore.
As folks are looking over the pictures and that sort of thing, if you have other things to say, that's fantastic. If you would like to make a motion, that would be fine too.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion. I move that the Historic Preservation Commission finds 1925 Hull Street does not meet the eligibility standards outlined in Section 14-22 of the Fort Collins Municipal Code and is not a historic resource for the purposes of project review under Land Use Code 3.4.7 based on the fact that the property does not meet requirements for historic significance and integrity.
Thank you, Commissioner Gunther. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Discussion on the motion.
I struggle with this one a little more. It looks more intact to me. Still not high style or anything, but I think it does convey the sense of the simple farmhouse. So I'm open to people's thoughts on that.
So it conveys the sense of a simple farmhouse because right now it's on a farm, right? I mean, I think the context matters significantly, and we're looking at it
Right. True.
as a building. If this were on, let's say, North McKinley Avenue, or LaPorte, I mean, in the context of a neighborhood, would you look at that and say, "Ah, yes, this demonstrates like the vernacular farmhouse style."
What if it was moved to the open space to the east, where 1901 is? It would have that open space around it. It would have the agricultural feel. It's something we allowed on that South College scenario. It needs to be moved anyway because it's going to have a street right off the front door. Jim, Rose, what do you think?
I still don't think we know enough, and I think the addition that's on the rear portion, I think, is an intrusion. It, it has a modern door, it has modern windows, it has different siding. So what it suggests to me is, and it's a significant addition. So if you wanted to say this is really a good vernacular example of an early 1924, which I think still it says exact date, but I still think that may be speculative. But then you have this addition with, horizontal windows and a different metal door and all the stuff that doesn't fit at all with the original fabric. And who knows when it was done, but it's what I would call an intrusion, and it's a significant enough intrusion that affects the overall integrity of the house to really convey a simple gabled structure that maybe had 4 rooms or 5 rooms. This doesn't have that, and who knows when it was added, but I just think that's a sufficient detriment to its overall condition that I don't think it possesses what it needs to possess.
I think everything Jim just said is confirmed in slide 430. If you take a look at that, if you're not already, that basically sums up the concerns that he expressed and that I would agree with.
Can we get clarification from staff on why? Because earlier you said additions like this don't detract from significance. Why in this particular case was the thought process behind that?
Certainly. So staff's finding relative to 1925 Hall Street was that the rear addition used similar siding, similar window materials, similar window pattern. So it was fairly consistent with the front of the house and consistent with what we'd expect to see on a vernacular farmhouse. That was really the justification behind it as not being a detraction. But again, if the commission has a different finding, that's what we're here for.
Mr. Chair, would you mind if I ask Becca a question?
Certainly.
I don't know if you want to come and speak to this, Becca, but you were on the property, I assume. I'd be interested in hearing what your thoughts are in terms of significance. And I mean, you've written it here, but if you've heard our concerns, and maybe you can help us think it through better.
Sure, I can do my best, I guess. I didn't bring a pen with me. Thank you. I appreciate that. My name is Rebecca Shields. I am the architectural historian that completed these site forms. I guess as far as significance, it is gratifying to see you all struggle with that a little bit as well, because I struggled with this for several days while I was working on these site forms. And my main reason for recommending them and saying that they're significant, I'm recommending them eligible and saying they're significant, is because they're so rare and there is no landmarked properties in this part of the town. There are probably better sites that represent agriculture in Fort Collins, but the rarity was one of the really strong things that I considered. As far as integrity for this property, in my understanding, it's pretty common for vernacular properties to be added upon, and so I don't see that as a detraction, especially if that addition was made in the historic period, if it was made with sympathetic materials, if it's mostly to the rear of the property, so it's not, extending to either side or overshadowing the original buildings. That was my rationale for that.
Thank you. I think that's helpful.
Thank you very much. Other discussion about this motion? Hearing none, the chair calls for a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nelson,
Yes.
Rose,
I'm sorry. Yes. I thought you said done.
I thought you were thinking.
You're trying to sneak out of voting.
Gibson,
Yes.
Gunther,
Yes.
Meg Dunn,
Yes.
Edwards,
Yes.
Knierim.
Yes.
The motion carries.
Mr.
Thank you.
Chair,
Yes,
I'd like to address Zell
certainly.
briefly. I know there's it's not in our motion and none of that, but just a friendly request is if there's some way you can somehow weave in farming community history in this project, and I don't know how and what it would look like. Obviously, you're not, I guess, I don't know if he would come back for the development review if there's no historic buildings nearby.
With this finding, that's correct. They would not come back to the commission.
So you're not going to see us again, but you're in our community and you're adding these homes, which we desperately need. And if there's any way you can do a hat tip toward the history, I would be really grateful.
Yeah, so we've already started designing the conceptually the houses. I don't know if everybody's aware, but the code requires we have to have 3 unique footprints with 3 different architectural features. And it's really easy at this point in this industry because farmhouse style is relatively popular. And so we've already pursued that, knowing that we may have to have some compatibility with these existing homes. Although I'd tell you the elevations look a lot nicer than what we just talked about. But anyway, as you would expect. But, I think there's an opportunity with that park. And as we did review some of the documentation we saw some great examples of other really nice homes and farmsteads that have been preserved and incorporated into developments as either a gateway feature or something else. We didn't have quite that same opportunity here. We struggled with that. But I think there's a great opportunity to do that here. And so I appreciate all your thoughts and your comments and your consideration. So thanks again. We really do appreciate it and look forward to being part of the community.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zell. And thanks for the question, Meg. All right, at this time, is there any other business? Jim.
Yes, one item of other business. I just want to